A white neighbor named George refuses to help the Smiths, a black family, during an emergency, but he's left in shock when he discovers the truth during his own time of desperation. How will George react when the tables are turned? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. George Matthews stood at his kitchen window, a steaming cup of black coffee in his hand. His eyes swept over the manicured lawn, scrutinizing every blade of grass as if searching for imperfections. At 50 years old, George's face was etched with deep lines, evidence of a life spent frowning more than smiling. The quiet suburban street outside was just stirring to life. A jogger passed by, waving cheerfully at George's house. George didn't wave back. He never did. "Another day," he muttered to himself, turning away from the window. His voice was gruff from disuse, a testament to how little he spoke to anyone these days. George's house was a model of tidiness and order. Everything had its place, and nothing was out of line. It was a stark reflection of the man himself, rigid, controlled, and utterly predictable. He moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. Shower at 7:15, breakfast at 7:30. By 8 a.m., he was seated in his study, poring over financial reports and stock market updates. Old habits died hard even in retirement. As the clock struck noon, George heard the familiar sound of children's laughter floating through his open window. The noise grated on his nerves. He stood up abruptly, marching over to slam the window shut. "Can't even have peace and quiet in my own home," he grumbled, returning to his desk. George's phone rang, breaking the silence. He glanced at the caller ID and frowned. It was his sister, probably calling to pester him about the upcoming family reunion. He let it go to voicemail. He had no interest in small talk or family gatherings. As evening approached, George prepared his solitary dinner. He ate at his pristine dining table, surrounded by empty chairs. The tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway was his only company. After dinner, George settled into his armchair with a book, but his eyes kept drifting to the window, watching as his neighbors returned home from work, greeted each other warmly, and disappeared into their brightly lit houses. For a brief moment, something flickered in George's eyes, a hint of loneliness, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual stern expression. He shook his head, as if to dismiss any unwelcome thoughts, and returned to his book. This was George Matthews' life, orderly, self-reliant, and utterly solitary, and that was exactly how he believed he wanted it to be. The quiet of George's neighborhood was disrupted one sunny morning by the rumble of a moving truck. George peered out his window, his brow furrowed in annoyance. A family was unloading boxes and furniture into the house across the street. The Smiths, a black, happy family, bustled about with energy and laughter. Mr. Smith, a tall man with a warm smile, directed the movers. Mrs. Smith, her hair tied back in a colorful scarf, unpacked boxes on the front lawn. Their 3 children darted around excitedly, exploring their new surroundings. George watched with growing irritation as the peaceful street filled with noise and activity. He shook his head and muttered, "There goes the neighborhood." Later that afternoon, George was tending to his immaculate front lawn when he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Mr. and Mrs. Smith walking towards him, their faces bright with friendly smiles. "Hello, neighbor," Mr. Smith called out, waving. "We're the Smiths. Just moved in across the street." George straightened up slowly, his face a mask of indifference. He didn't respond, just stared at them coldly. Mrs. Smith, undeterred by his frosty reception, stepped forward. "We wanted to introduce ourselves properly. I'm Linda. This is my husband, Mark, and our children are just over there." She gestured to where the kids were playing on their new lawn. George's eyes flicked briefly to the children, then back to the couple. His voice was flat when he finally spoke. "George Matthews. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm busy." The Smiths exchanged a surprised glance. Mark tried once more. "We're having a little housewarming barbecue this weekend. We'd love it if you could join us. Get to know the neighbors." "Not interested," George cut him off abruptly. He turned his back on them and resumed his yard work, effectively dismissing them. Linda's smile faltered, but she managed to say, "Well, the invitation stands if you change your mind. It was nice to meet you, Mr. Matthews." As the Smiths walked away, George could hear their hushed conversation. "Maybe he was just having a bad day," Linda whispered. Mark sighed. "Let's hope so. Everyone else has been so welcoming." George ignored the twinge of guilt he felt. He didn't need new friends, especially not a noisy family disturbing his peace. He was better off alone, just as he had always been. A week after their initial encounter, Linda Smith stood on George's porch, holding a freshly baked apple pie. The warm, sweet aroma wafted through the air as she rang the doorbell, a hopeful smile on her face. George opened the door, his expression hardening when he saw who it was. "Yes?" he asked curtly. Linda's smile didn't waver. "Good afternoon, Mr. Matthews. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I baked this pea and thought you might enjoy a slice." George's eyes darted from Linda's face to the pie and back again. For a moment, his stern facade cracked, revealing a flicker of surprise at the unexpected kindness. "That's unnecessary," he muttered, but his hands reached out almost involuntarily to take the pie. Linda beamed. "It's no trouble at all. We just wanted to—" Before she could finish, George cut her off. "Thank you," he said abruptly, already stepping back into his house. "Good day." The door closed with a firm click, leaving Linda standing on the porch, her smile fading. She sighed softly and turned to walk back home. Inside, George placed the pie on his kitchen counter, eyeing it warily as if it might suddenly sprout legs and start dancing. The gesture had caught him off guard, stirring emotions he'd long since buried. Across the street, Linda rejoined her family in their front yard. Mark looked up from where he was playing catch with their oldest son. "How did it go?" he asked, noticing her subdued expression. Linda shrugged. "He took the pea, but he didn't seem very interested in talking." Their daughter, overhearing, frowned. "Why doesn't Mr. Matthews like us, Mom?" Linda knelt down, pulling her daughter into a hug. "Oh, sweetie, I'm sure it's not that he doesn't like us. Some people just need more time to warm up to others. We'll keep being kind and patient." Mark nodded, joining his wife and daughter. "That's right. Everyone has their own story, and we don't know Mr. Matthews's yet. The best thing we can do is continue to be good neighbors and respect his space." The family shared a moment of understanding, their warmth and compassion a stark contrast to the cold silence emanating from George's house. Despite the rejection, they remained determined to approach their reclusive neighbor with kindness and empathy. As night fell, an ominous darkness settled over the neighborhood. The sky rumbled with thunder, and flashes of lightning illuminated the worried faces of the Smith family. Rain lashed against windows, and wind howled through the trees, snapping branches and toppling power lines. Inside their home, the Smiths huddled together, their usual warmth and cheer replaced by growing concern. Their youngest son, Jason, lay on the couch, his small body racked with fever. Mrs. Smith pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, her eyes filled with worry. "Mark, his temperature's not going down," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to get him to a hospital." Mr. Smith nodded grimly, peering out the window at the raging storm. "The power's out everywhere. Our car won't start, and the roads might not be safe." Suddenly, a flash of lightning revealed a glimmer of hope across the street. George's house stood apart from the darkness, a faint light visible through his curtains. Mrs. Smith gasped. "George's house. He must have a generator." Mr. Smith's eyes widened with realization. "And maybe a working car. It's our only chance." The couple exchanged a look of determination tinged with apprehension. They knew George had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with them, but Jason's worsening condition left them no choice. "I'll go," Mr. Smith said, pulling on his raincoat. "You stay with the kids." Mrs. Smith caught his arm. "No, we'll go together. He needs to see how serious this is." Wrapping Jason in a blanket, they stepped out into the howling wind and driving rain. They hurried across the street, their hearts pounding with each step. As they reached George's porch, they hesitated for a moment before Mr. Smith raised his hand and knocked firmly on the door. Seconds ticked by like hours as they waited, holding their breath. Finally, the porch light flickered on, and the door creaked open. George stood there, his face a mask of surprise and irritation. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice barely audible over the storm. Mrs. Smith stepped forward, cradling Jason in her arms. "Please, Mr. Matthews," she pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. "Our son is very sick. We need to get him to a hospital, but our car won't start. Can you help us?" George's eyes widened as he took in the sight before him. The Smiths, drenched and desperate, with their young son bundled in their arms. For a moment, his stern expression faltered, revealing a flicker of concern. Mrs. Smith stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Please, Mr. Matthews, Jason's burning up with fever. We need to get him to the hospital right away." Mr. Smith added urgently, "Our car won't start and the power's out everywhere. You're our only hope." George's brow furrowed as he glanced from the sick child to his parents' pleading faces. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between his instinct to help and his desire to remain uninvolved. I can't," he stammered, his voice gruff. "My car doesn't have enough fuel to make it to the hospital." Mrs. Smith's face fell, her eyes brimming with tears. "But surely there's something you can do? We're desperate." George's jaw clenched, his discomfort growing by the second. He shook his head firmly, retreating behind his door. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you. You'll have to find another way." With that, he abruptly shut the door, leaving the Smith standing in shock on his porch. The sound of the lock clicking into place seemed to echo in the stormy night. Mr. and Mrs. Smith exchanged devastated looks, the reality of their situation sinking in. They were stranded, with their sick child, in the middle of a raging storm. The Smiths stumbled away from George's porch, their hearts heavy with disappointment. As they reached the sidewalk, a car's headlights pierced through the rain-soaked darkness. It was their neighbor from 2 houses down, Mrs. Johnson, returning home from a late shift at the hospital. Seeing the family's distress, Mrs. Johnson pulled over immediately. "What's wrong?" she called out, rolling down her window. Mr. Smith explained their situation quickly, his voice shaking. Without hesitation, Mrs. Johnson offered to drive them to the hospital. They piled into her car, Jason whimpering softly in his mother's arms. The drive was tense, with Mrs. Smith whispering soothing words to Jason, while Mr. Smith stared out the window, lost in thought. They arrived at the emergency room just in time. The doctors quickly diagnosed Jason with a severe case of pneumonia and started treatment right away. Hours later, as Jason rested comfortably in a hospital bed, the Smith family gathered in the quiet waiting room. The immediate danger had passed, but the weight of their earlier encounter with George still hung over them. Mrs. Smith broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just can't understand it. How could anyone turn away a sick child?" Mr. Smith shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and confusion. "I've never met anyone so cold. It's like he didn't even care." Their oldest daughter, Lily, spoke up. Maybe he was scared? Or maybe he really didn't have enough gas in his car? "Even if that were true," Mrs. Smith replied gently, "he could have offered to help in some other way, called for help, or let us use his phone. Anything." Mr. Smith nodded in agreement. "It's not just about tonight. We've tried to be friendly since we moved in, but he's shut us out at every turn. I wonder what made him so... heartless?" Lily suggested. "No, not heartless," Mrs. Smith corrected. "Just very, very alone." The family fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts about their mysterious neighbor. Despite their hurt and confusion, there was a hint of compassion in their eyes as they considered what could have led George to become so isolated. As the days passed, the neighborhood slowly recovered from the storm's aftermath. Fallen branches were cleared, damaged roofs were repaired, and the hum of everyday life gradually returned to the quiet suburban street. George watched from behind his living room curtains as the Smith family went about their daily routines. He saw Mr. Smith mowing the lawn, Mrs. Smith tending to her newly planted flower beds, and the children playing in the front yard. Despite the warmth and laughter that seemed to radiate from their home, George remained steadfast in his decision to keep his distance. He convinced himself that his actions during the storm had been justified. "Everyone should handle their own problems," he muttered to himself as he observed the Smiths from afar. "I'm not responsible for their emergencies." George continued his solitary life, sticking to his rigid routines. He'd wake up at precisely 6:30 a.m., have his coffee while reading the newspaper, and then spent his days managing his investments or tending to his meticulously organized home. The world outside his four walls held little interest for him. Occasionally, he'd catch Mrs. Smith's eye as she walked by with her groceries, or he'd hear Mr. Smith's friendly, "Good morning," from across the street. Each time, George would quickly look away or retreat inside, avoiding any possibility of interaction. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. He believed that self-reliance was a virtue, and that by refusing to help, he was teaching the Smiths an important lesson about independence. Yet, deep down, a small voice nagged at him, questioning the righteousness of his actions. As weeks turned into months, George noticed that the neighbors had stopped trying to include him in their activities. There were no more invitations to backyard barbecues, no more attempts at friendly conversation over the fence. He told himself that this was exactly what he wanted, to be left alone. But as he sat in his quiet house, watching the world go by outside his window, a feeling he couldn't quite name began to gnaw at the edges of his carefully constructed solitude. George's meticulously planned routine began to unravel on a crisp autumn morning. As he rose from bed, a wave of dizziness washed over him, causing him to stumble slightly. He shook his head, dismissing the sensation as nothing more than a momentary lapse. "Must be stress," he muttered to himself, straightening his robe and heading downstairs for his usual morning coffee. Throughout the day, George noticed small changes in his body. His muscles ached more than usual, and a persistent headache throbbed behind his eyes. He pushed through, determined not to let these minor inconveniences disrupt his carefully ordered life. By afternoon, a dry cough had developed, scratching at his throat. George reached for a glass of water, telling himself it was just a touch of a cold. "Nothing to worry about," he reassured himself, though his voice sounded raspy even to his own ears. As evening approached, George felt a chill creep into his bones despite the warmth of his home. He wrapped himself in a thick blanket and settled into his armchair, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge the growing discomfort in his body. "I don't need a doctor," he grumbled, reaching for the TV remote with a shaky hand. "It'll pass on its own." George's eyes grew heavy as he watched the evening news, his thoughts becoming foggy. He drifted in and out of consciousness, unaware of the passage of time. When he finally roused himself to go to bed, his legs felt weak and unsteady beneath him. As he climbed the stairs, each step felt like a monumental effort. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his breath came in short, labored gasps. Still, George pressed on, convinced that a good night's sleep would cure whatever ailed him. He collapsed into bed, pulling the covers tight around his trembling form. As he closed his eyes, George remained oblivious to the severity of his condition, his stubborn independence blinding him to the danger he faced. As dawn broke, George awoke to a sharp, crushing pain in his chest. It felt like an elephant was sitting on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. He gasped, trying to catch his breath, but each inhale was a struggle. "It's nothing," he wheezed, gripping the edge of his nightstand. "Just indigestion." George slowly pushed himself up, wincing as the pain intensified. Sweat trickled down his forehead and his left arm felt oddly numb. He shook it, trying to restore feeling, but the tingling sensation persisted. "I can handle this," he muttered, stumbling towards the bathroom. His reflection in the mirror startled him. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with fear he refused to acknowledge. As he splashed cold water on his face, another wave of pain crashed over him. George gritted his teeth, determined to push through it. He'd always prided himself on his self-reliance, and he wasn't about to let a little discomfort change that. Throughout the morning, George tried to go about his usual routine, but each movement was a battle. The pain in his chest ebbed and flowed, sometimes easing enough to let him believe it was passing, only to return with renewed intensity. By midday, George could no longer deny that something was seriously wrong. The pain had become unbearable, radiating through his chest and down his left arm. His breath came in short, desperate gasps, and a cold sweat covered his body. Fear gripped him as he realized he might be having a heart attack. The stubborn wall of independence he'd built around himself began to crumble. For the first time in years, George faced the terrifying truth that he couldn't handle this alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across George's living room, he felt a sudden, overwhelming pain in his chest. It was unlike anything he'd ever experienced before, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. No, George gasped, clutching at his shirt. This can't be happening. He stumbled towards the kitchen where his phone lay on the counter. Each step was a monumental effort, his vision blurring as the pain intensified. George's left arm felt heavy and numb, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Just a few more steps, he thought desperately. I can make it. But his body had other plans. George's legs gave out beneath him, and he crumpled to the floor with a soft thud. His fingers clawed at the linoleum, trying to drag himself closer to the phone, but it was no use. The pain was too much. As consciousness began to slip away, George's eyes darted to his front door. He'd left it slightly ajar earlier when he'd brought in the mail, forgetting to close it properly in his haste to get back to his solitude. Now that small oversight left him exposed and vulnerable. "Help!" he tried to call out, but his voice was barely a whisper. The open door seemed to mock him, a reminder of the connections he'd pushed away and the help he'd refused. George's eyelids grew heavy, the room around him fading to darkness. His last conscious thought was a bitter realization of his predicament, alone and in desperate need of the very thing he'd spent years rejecting, human connection. As George slipped into unconsciousness, he lay motionless on the floor, the open door his only link to the outside world. The evening breeze gently rustled the curtains, oblivious to the dire situation unfolding within. As the Smith family's minivan pulled into their driveway, laden with groceries, Mr. Smith's eyes drifted across the street. He frowned, noticing something unusual about George's house. "Honey," he said, turning to his wife, "does George's door look open to you?" Mrs. Smith squinted, then nodded. "It does. That's odd for him, isn't it?" The couple exchanged worried glances. Their children, busy unbuckling seatbelts, hadn't noticed the conversation. Mr. Smith chewed his lip, conflicted. "Maybe we should check on him," he suggested hesitantly. Mrs. Smith's brow furrowed. "After how he treated us during the storm?" she asked, her voice tinged with hurt. Mr. Smith nodded slowly. "I know, but it's the right thing to do. What if he's in trouble?" Mrs. Smith sighed, then managed a small smile. "You're right. We can't ignore someone who might need help, no matter how they've acted before." They turned to their children. "Kids, start taking the groceries inside. We're going to check on Mr. Matthews real quick." Hand in hand, Mr. and Mrs. Smith crossed the street. As they approached George's house, they could see the door was indeed ajar, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. "Mr. Matthews?" Mr. Smith called out, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Are you all right in there?" Silence greeted them. Mrs. Smith squeezed her husband's hand, a flicker of worry crossing her face. They reached the front porch, exchanging another glance before Mr. Smith gently pushed the door open wider. "Mr. Matthews?" he called again, louder this time. "It's the Smiths from across the street. We noticed your door was open and wanted to make sure everything's okay." As they peered into the dimly lit entryway, Mrs. Smith gasped. There, on the floor of the living room, lay George's motionless form. "Oh my God," she whispered, her free hand flying to her mouth. "Is he—" Mr. Smith's face set with determination. "Call 911, he said firmly, already stepping inside. "I'll check on him." The Smiths rushed into George's home, their hearts pounding with fear and concern. The living room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the floor where George lay motionless. Mrs. Smith's hand trembled as she knelt beside him, her eyes wide with worry. "George, can you hear me?" she called softly, gently shaking his shoulder. There was no response. With shaking fingers, Mrs. Smith pressed 2 fingers against George's neck, searching for a pulse. She held her breath, praying silently. After a moment, she felt a faint, irregular beat beneath her fingertips. "He's alive," she said, her voice quivering with relief and urgency. "But his pulse is weak and irregular." Mr. Smith had already pulled out his cell phone, his fingers flying over the keypad as he dialed 911. He paced back and forth, his free hand clenched tightly at his side as he waited for the call to connect. 911, what's your emergency?" A calm voice answered. "We need an ambulance right away," Mr. Smith said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Our neighbor is unconscious on his living room floor. We think he might have had a heart attack." "What's the address?" the dispatcher asked. Mr. Smith rattled off George's address, then continued. He's a man in his 50s. He's not responding, but my wife says he has a weak pulse. Okay, sir. I'm dispatching an ambulance to your location now, the dispatcher assured him. Can you tell me if he's breathing? Mr. Smith looked to his wife questioningly. Mrs. Smith leaned in close to George's face, listening intently. After a moment, she nodded, relief washing over her features. Yes, he's breathing, Mr. Smith relayed to the dispatcher. But it seems shallow and labored. All right, help is on the way, the dispatcher said. I'm going to stay on the line with you and walk you through what to do until the paramedics arrive. As Mr. Smith listened intently to the dispatcher's instructions, Mrs. Smith held George's hand, whispering words of encouragement. The room was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the sound of George's labored breathing, and Mr. Smith's steady voice as he followed the dispatcher's guidance. As the Smiths waited anxiously for the ambulance, they sprang into action, determined to do everything in their power to keep George stable. Mrs. Smith knelt beside George, her hands clasped together on his chest as she began administering CPR. Her movements were precise and rhythmic, fueled by a mix of adrenaline and compassion. Sarah, honey, Mr. Smith called out to their eldest daughter, who stood wide-eyed in the doorway. Run home and grab our first aid kit, quick. Sarah nodded and dashed across the street, her sneakers pounding against the pavement. Within moments, she returned, breathless, clutching the family's well-stocked first aid kit. Good job, sweetie, Mrs. Smith said, her voice strained as she continued compressions. Open it up and hand me the rescue mask. Sarah's hand shook slightly as she unzipped the kit and retrieved the plastic mask. She passed it to her mother, who quickly placed it over George's mouth and nose before resuming CPR. The tension in the room was palpable. The ticking of the clock on George's wall seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Mr. Smith paced back and forth, his eyes darting between his wife's determined efforts and the window, watching for any sign of the ambulance. Come on, George, Mrs. Smith murmured between breaths. Stay with us. You can do this. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on the Smiths. Here they were, fighting to save the life of a man who had turned them away in their own moment of need. But in this critical moment, George's past coldness didn't matter. All that mattered was keeping him alive. Sarah stood by, ready to help in any way she could. Her younger siblings, Jason and Emily, huddled together in the hallway, their faces a mix of fear and concern. Is Mr. George going to be okay? Emily whispered, her small hand clutching Jason's arm. I hope so, Jason replied, his voice barely audible. Mom and Dad are doing everything they can. As the minutes ticked by, the Smiths worked tirelessly. Mr. Smith took over the chest compressions when Mrs. Smith's arms began to tire. They switched back and forth, their determination never wavering. The wail of sirens pierced the tense silence, growing louder as the ambulance approached. Mr. Smith rushed to the window, his heart pounding with relief. They're here, he called out, his voice cracking with emotion. Moments later, 2 paramedics burst through the front door, their faces set with determination. They quickly assessed the situation, their trained eyes taking in George's unconscious form and the Smiths' exhausted but resolute expressions. We've been doing CPR, Mrs. Smith explained breathlessly, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. He was unresponsive when we found him. The paramedics nodded, immediately taking over. They worked with practiced efficiency, attaching monitors and preparing George for transport. The Smith family stepped back, watching anxiously as the professionals took charge. You did good, one of the paramedics said, glancing up at the Smiths. Your quick action might have just saved his life. Those words hung in the air as George was carefully lifted onto a stretcher. The Smiths followed them out to the ambulance, their faces etched with concern. As the paramedics loaded George into the vehicle, Mrs. Smith reached out and gently squeezed his hand. Hang in there, George, she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. The ambulance doors closed with a soft thud and the vehicle sped away, its sirens once again piercing the quiet neighborhood. The Smith family stood on the sidewalk watching until the flashing lights disappeared around the corner. A heavy silence fell over them as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Mr. Smith wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders, pulling her close. "If we hadn't checked on him," Mrs. Smith began, her voice trailing off. "But we did," Mr. Smith reassured her, his voice gentle but firm. "We were there when he needed help the most." The children huddled close to their parents, their young faces a mix of worry and hope. Jason, remembering his own recent health scare, looked up at his mother. "Do you think Mr. George will be okay?" he asked softly. Mrs. Smith knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with her son. "I hope so, sweetheart. The doctors will do everything they can to help him." As they made their way back to their own home, the Smiths felt a whirlwind of emotions. They were shaken by the intensity of what they had just experienced, but there was also a sense of relief that they had been able to help when it mattered most. At the hospital, George lay in a sterile white room, the steady beep of monitors filling the air. His eyes fluttered open, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. A nurse noticed him stirring and quickly called for the doctor. "Mr. Matthews," the doctor said gently, approaching his bedside, "you've had a heart attack. You're lucky to be alive." George's brow furrowed in confusion. "What happened?" he asked, his voice weak and raspy. The doctor explained the situation, emphasizing how critical his condition had been. "If your neighbors hadn't found you when they did, we might be having a very different conversation right now." George's eyes widened in surprise. "Neighbors?" he whispered. "Yes, the Smith family across the street," the doctor confirmed. "They found you unconscious and performed CPR until the ambulance arrived. Their quick action saved your life." As the doctor continued to explain his condition and treatment, George's mind wandered. He thought about the Smiths, the family he had coldly dismissed time and time again, the family whose plea for help he had ignored during the storm. And yet, they were the ones who had come to his rescue. A lump formed in George's throat as he remembered his own callousness. He had always prided himself on his self-reliance, but now he realized how misguided that pride had been. In his moment of greatest need, it wasn't his independence that saved him. It was the kindness of the very people he had pushed away. Tears welled up in George's eyes as the weight of his actions and the Smiths' forgiveness truly hit him. He had been so wrong about them, so wrong about everything. The warmth and compassion they had shown him despite his previous behavior touched something deep within him. As he lay there, surrounded by beeping machines and the sterile smell of the hospital, George felt a shift inside himself. The walls he had built around his heart began to crumble. For the first time in years, he felt a desire to reach out, to connect. As George lay in his hospital bed, the weight of his actions pressed heavily upon him. The steady beep of the heart monitor served as a constant reminder of how close he had come to death, and how the Smith family had pulled him back from the brink. He stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the countless times he had rebuffed their kindness. The homemade pie, the friendly waves, the desperate plea for help during the storm, all met with his cold indifference. Yet, when he needed help the most, they hadn't hesitated to save him. Tears welled up in George's eyes, spilling down his cheeks. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty room. The realization of his own cruelty hit him like a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air. For years, George had prided himself on his self-reliance. He had built walls around his heart, convinced that he needed no one. But now, those walls were crumbling, revealing the lonely, frightened man behind them. He thought about how differently things might have turned out if the Smiths hadn't found him. The image of himself lying alone on the floor, slowly slipping away, sent a shudder through his body. His vaunted independence had nearly cost him his life. As the days passed, George found himself longing for company. He watched the door, hoping for visitors, but knowing he deserved none. The kindness of the hospital staff only served to highlight the stark contrast with his own behavior. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the window, George made a decision. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to be better. The thought terrified him, opening up, letting people in. But he knew it was necessary. "I've been such a fool," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "All this time I thought I was strong, but real strength is what the Smiths showed me. Kindness, forgiveness, compassion." George closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the enormity of the change he needed to make. Years of habits and beliefs wouldn't disappear overnight, but he was determined to try. He owed it to the Smiths, and to himself, to become the kind of person who helped others instead of turning them away. As George lay in his hospital bed, the weight of his past actions bore down on him. He realized that his life had become a hollow shell, devoid of warmth and connection. The kindness shown by the Smith family had cracked open the fortress he had built around his heart, revealing the emptiness within. Tears welled up in George's eyes as he thought about how he had treated the Smiths. "I've been such a fool," he whispered to himself, his voice cracking with emotion. The memory of shutting the door on their desperate pleas for help during the storm made him wince with shame. George's mind wandered to his solitary existence. His house, once a symbol of his independence, now felt like a prison. He had no one to share his thoughts with, no one to care if he lived or died. The realization hit him hard. His stubbornness and fear of vulnerability had only brought him more pain. "I have to make this right," George muttered, clenching his fists with determination. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Years of pushing people away had left him rusty in the art of human connection. But the Smiths had shown him a glimpse of what life could be like if he opened his heart. George closed his eyes, imagining what it would be like to have friends, to be part of a community. The thought both excited and terrified him. He had spent so long convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, but now he saw the lie for what it was. "I'll apologize to them," he decided, his voice growing stronger. "I'll tell them how sorry I am for everything, and then I'll try to be better." The path ahead seemed daunting, but for the first time in years, George felt a flicker of hope. He knew he couldn't change overnight, but he was determined to try. The Smiths had saved his life, and now he wanted to save himself from the loneliness he had created. As George stepped out of the taxi in front of his house, he felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The familiar sight of his home brought comfort, but the weight of his mission made his heart race. He clutched a bouquet of colorful flowers in his trembling hands, a peace offering he hoped would soften the awkwardness of the conversation to come. Taking a deep breath, George slowly made his way across the street towards the Smiths' house. Each step felt like a monumental effort, both from his weakened state and the nervousness that gripped him. He paused at the foot of their driveway, his resolve wavering for a moment. "Come on, George," he muttered to himself, "you can do this." As he approached the front door, George's mind raced with doubts. What if they slammed the door in his face? What if they refused to forgive him? The thought made his stomach churn, but he pushed forward. He owed them this much and more. With a shaky hand, George reached out and pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed through the house, and he heard movement inside. His heart pounded in his chest as footsteps approached the door. The door swung open, revealing Mrs. Smith. Her eyes widened in surprise as she recognized George standing there, looking pale and holding a bouquet of flowers. "Mr. Matthews," she said, her voice a mix of concern and confusion. "Are you all right? Should you be out of the hospital?" George swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice. I'm okay," he managed to say. "I was hoping. Could I speak with you and your family for a moment?" Mrs. Smith hesitated, clearly unsure about how to respond. George felt a lump forming in his throat, fearing rejection. But then her expression softened and she nodded. "Of course, please come in," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. George took a tentative step into the warmth of the Smiths' home, the scent of freshly baked cookies filling the air. He felt out of place, like an intruder in this cozy family setting. As Mrs. Smith led him to the living room, George's nervousness intensified. He knew the next few moments would be crucial in his journey towards redemption and connection. As George entered the living room, he saw Mr. Smith rise from his armchair, a look of surprise on his face. The children, who had been playing a board game on the floor, fell silent and stared at their unexpected visitor. "Mr. Matthews," Mr. Smith said, his voice calm but cautious. "It's good to see you up and about. Please have a seat." George lowered himself into an offered chair, wincing slightly as his still healing body protested. He placed the bouquet on the coffee table, his hands now free to fidget nervously in his lap. I wanted to thank you," George began, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. "What you did for me, I can't even begin to express my gratitude." Mrs. Smith sat down next to her husband, her eyes filled with compassion. "We're just glad you're okay, Mr. Matthews." George nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he needed to say next. I need to apologize. The way I treated you when you needed help. It was inexcusable." His voice cracked with emotion and he paused to collect himself. The Smiths waited patiently, their faces showing no judgment, only understanding. "I've been so caught up in my own world thinking I didn't need anyone," George continued. "But you showed me what true kindness looks like. You saved my life even after I turned you away. I'm so sorry for my behavior." Mr. Smith leaned forward, his expression serious but gentle. "Mr. Matthews, we appreciate your apology, but please know that we hold no ill will toward you. We did what any neighbor would do." Mrs. Smith nodded in agreement. "We're just thankful we were there to help, and we're so glad you're recovering well." George felt tears welling up in his eyes, overwhelmed by the Smiths' forgiveness and warmth. For the first time in years, he felt a connection to others, a sense of belonging he had long forgotten. The Smith family invites George inside for tea, and they begin to talk, slowly breaking down the barriers that had kept them apart. "Mr. Matthews, I'm glad you're feeling better," Mrs. Smith mentioned. "Can I get you some tea?" she added. George hesitated for a moment, then nodded gratefully. "I'd like that very much," he said softly. Mrs. Smith bustled to the kitchen to prepare tea while Mr. Smith and the children made George comfortable in the living room. As they settled in, George couldn't help but notice the warmth that seemed to radiate from every corner of the house. It was so different from his own cold, empty home. When Mrs. Smith returned with a tray of steaming mugs, George wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic, feeling its comforting heat seep into his bones. He took a sip, savoring the rich flavor and the kindness behind the gesture. "Mr. Matthews," Mrs. Smith began gently, "if you don't mind us asking, what made you decide to keep to yourself all these years?" George looked down at his mug, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was low and filled with emotion. "I guess it all started when I was young. My father was a stern man who believed that relying on others was a sign of weakness. He drilled that into me from an early age." The Smiths listened attentively, their faces showing genuine interest and empathy. Encouraged by their reaction, George continued. "As I grew older, I threw myself into my work. I built my business from the ground up, never asking for help, never trusting anyone else to do the job right. It worked for a while. But looking back now, I can see how lonely that path was." George paused, taking another sip of tea. "Then about 10 years ago, I thought I'd finally found someone to share my life with. But she was only interested in my money. When I found out, it broke something in me. I decided then that I was better off alone." Mrs. Smith reached out and patted George's hand gently. "Oh, Mr. Matthews, I'm so sorry you had to go through that." George felt a lump form in his throat at her kindness. "Thank you," he whispered. "I've been so foolish, pushing everyone away. I never realized what I was missing until you folks came along." Mr. Smith leaned forward, his eyes kind but serious. "It's never too late to make a change, Mr. Matthews. We're here for you, as neighbors, and, if you'd like, as friends." George looked around at the Smith family, seeing nothing but sincerity and warmth in their faces. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope ignite in his heart. Maybe, just maybe, he could learn to open up again. As the days passed, George found himself drawn more and more to the Smith family's warmth and kindness. He started by offering to mow their lawn, insisting it was the least he could do after they saved his life. Mr. Smith accepted graciously, and soon George was a regular fixture in their front yard, pushing the mower back and forth under the summer sun. One Saturday morning, George noticed Mr. Smith struggling with a broken fence post. Without hesitation, he walked over and offered his help. Together, they spent the afternoon repairing the fence, sharing stories and laughs. It was the most George had spoken to anyone in years, and he found himself enjoying every minute of it. Mrs. Smith often invited George over for dinner, and he rarely declined. The aroma of home-cooked meals and the sound of laughter filled the air as he sat at their table, surrounded by the family's chatter. The children, initially shy around him, began to warm up to his presence. Sarah, the eldest, discovered George's talent for math and started asking for his help with her homework. George found himself looking forward to these tutoring sessions, patiently explaining complex problems and beaming with pride when Sarah's grades improved. Jason, the youngest, took to following George around like a shadow whenever he visited. George taught him how to build model airplanes, a hobby he had long abandoned, but now rediscovered with renewed enthusiasm. The joy in Jason's eyes as they worked together on intricate models reminded George of the simple pleasures he had denied himself for so long. As weeks turned into months, George's life transformed. His house, once a fortress of solitude, now echoed with the sounds of children's laughter and friendly conversation. He found himself smiling more, his stern demeanor softening with each passing day. The Smiths, true to their word, embraced George as one of their own. They invited him to family game nights, backyard barbecues, and even their annual camping trip. George, who had spent years avoiding such gatherings, now found himself eagerly anticipating these events. As the weeks passed, George found himself spending more and more time with the Smith family. But it was Jason, the youngest child, who truly captured his heart. The boy's infectious smile and curious nature reminded George of the wonder and joy he had long forgotten. One sunny afternoon, George noticed Jason struggling with his math homework on the front porch. Without hesitation, he walked over and offered to help. Jason's face lit up, and soon they were sitting side by side, working through fractions and decimals. "You're really good at this, Mr. George," Jason exclaimed, his eyes wide with admiration. George felt a warmth spread through his chest. "Well, I've had a lot of practice," he said with a gentle smile. "Math can be fun if you look at it the right way." From that day on, George became Jason's unofficial tutor. They would sit together at the kitchen table, surrounded by textbooks and worksheets, George patiently explaining concepts and encouraging Jason's efforts. Mrs. Smith would often peek in, her heart swelling at the sight of the once gruff neighbor now so tender with her son. As spring arrived, George decided to share another passion with Jason: gardening. He invited the boy to help him plant a small vegetable patch in his backyard. Jason eagerly dug his hands into the soil, listening intently as George explained about seeds, soil, and sunlight. "Can we grow tomatoes?" Jason asked excitedly. "They're my favorite." George chuckled. "Of course we can. And when they're ripe, we'll make the best tomato sandwich you've ever tasted." Their gardening sessions became a regular occurrence, with Jason rushing over after school to check on their growing plants. George taught him how to water properly, pull weeds, and even how to identify beneficial insects. Jason soaked up the knowledge like a sponge, his enthusiasm infectious. On weekends, George and Jason would take long walks around the neighborhood. George pointed out different trees and flowers, sharing stories about the area's history. Jason would ask endless questions, and George found himself rediscovering the world through the boy's eyes. During one of their walks, Jason suddenly stopped and looked up at George. "Mr. George, you're like the grandpa I never had," he said softly. George felt his eyes mist over. He placed a gentle hand on Jason's shoulder. "And you, Jason, have brought more joy into my life than I ever thought possible." As they continued their walk, George realized how much his life had changed. The bond he shared with Jason had filled a void he didn't even know existed. In teaching and nurturing this young boy, George had found a renewed sense of purpose and a happiness he thought was long lost. As George sat in his living room one evening, surrounded by the warmth of his new friendships, he found himself lost in thought. His eyes wandered to an old photo album tucked away on a dusty shelf. With trembling hands, he pulled it down and began to flip through the pages. Faces he hadn't seen in years stared back at him: old college buddies, former co-workers, and even distant family members. Each photo brought a flood of memories, both happy and bittersweet. George realized with a pang of regret how much he had missed out on by pushing these people away. "I've been such a fool," he whispered to himself, tracing the outline of a smiling face in one of the photos. The next morning, George woke up with a sense of determination. He pulled out his address book, long neglected, and began to make a list. With each name he wrote down, he felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. Taking a deep breath, George picked up his phone and dialed the first number on his list. It was his old friend Tom from college. "Hello?" A familiar voice answered. George's heart raced. "Tom, it's George Matthews. I know it's been a long time, but I was hoping we could catch up." There was a moment of silence, then Tom's voice softened. "George? Well, I'll be. It's great to hear from you, old friend." As they talked, George felt the years of isolation melting away. He apologized for losing touch and shared stories about his recent experiences with the Smith family. Tom listened with interest and warmth, and by the end of the call, they had made plans to meet for coffee. Encouraged by this positive interaction, George continued down his list. He reached out to cousins he hadn't spoken to in years, former colleagues, and even his estranged sister. Some conversations were awkward at first, but most were filled with forgiveness and a genuine desire to reconnect. With each call, George felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The Smith family had shown him the value of community, and now he was extending that lesson to rebuild the connections he had once severed. George's newfound sense of purpose led him to take a bold step. One sunny morning, he approached Mr. Smith with an offer to volunteer at the Veterans Foundation. Mr. Smith's eyes lit up with surprise and joy. "George, that would be wonderful," Mr. Smith exclaimed, clasping George's hand warmly. "We could really use your expertise." And so George found himself stepping into a world he had long ignored. The Veterans Foundation was a bustling place, filled with people dedicated to helping those who had served their country. At first, George felt out of place, but the warmth and camaraderie of the volunteers soon put him at ease. George's business acumen proved invaluable. He pored over financial reports, identifying areas where they could cut costs and increase efficiency. His sharp mind, once focused solely on his own success, now worked tirelessly to benefit others. "I never thought I'd be good at fundraising," George admitted to Mr. Smith one day, "but it turns out I love it." Indeed, George threw himself into organizing charity events with gusto. He reached out to his old business contacts, persuading them to contribute to the cause. His persistence and charm worked wonders, and soon the foundation saw a significant increase in donations. But it wasn't just about the money for George. He found himself deeply moved by the stories of the veterans they helped. Each life touched by the foundation's work filled George with a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. One evening, as George helped set up for a fundraising dinner, he caught sight of his reflection in a window. The man staring back at him was different from the one who had shut his door on the Smith family months ago. This George had a spark in his eye and a genuine smile on his face. "You've really found your calling here, haven't you?" Mrs. Smith said, coming up beside him. George nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "I have," he replied softly, "and I have your family to thank for it." As the event began and George watched Mr. Smith welcome the guests, he felt a deep sense of belonging. He was part of something bigger than himself now, contributing to a cause that mattered. And in doing so, he had found a joy and purpose he never knew existed. As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood began to take notice of the remarkable change in George. Once known as the reclusive and cold man who lived alone, George was now a familiar and welcome face at community events and gatherings. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly lady who lived 2 houses down, couldn't help but smile as she watched George mow her lawn one Saturday morning. Who would have thought, she mused to herself, remembering how she used to avoid even making eye contact with him. George's involvement in the community grew steadily. He volunteered to help organize the annual block party, using his planning skills to make it the best one yet. Children who once crossed the street to avoid him now waved enthusiastically when they saw him coming. At the local park, George could often be found helping to maintain the community garden. His own garden, once hidden behind tall fences, was now open for all to admire. He even started giving gardening tips to interested neighbors. "It's like night and day," Mr. Peterson remarked to his wife as they watched George help a young couple jumpstart their car. "Remember how he used to just watch from his window when people needed help?" George's generosity extended beyond just his time. When he learned that the local food bank was struggling, he organized a neighborhood-wide food drive. The response was overwhelming, and George felt a warmth in his chest as he helped deliver box after box of donations. The transformation was indeed profound. George found himself looking forward to each day, eager to see how he could make a difference. The satisfaction he felt was unlike anything he had experienced in his years of solitary living. One evening, as George sat on his front porch, he overheard a conversation between 2 passers-by. "That's George," one said to the other. "He's the kindest man you'll ever meet, always ready to lend a hand." George smiled to himself, feeling a deep sense of contentment. He realized that in opening his heart to others, he had not only changed his own life, but had become a positive force in the lives of those around him. As the seasons changed, George found himself spending more and more time with the Smith family. What started as occasional visits soon blossomed into a deep, familial bond that filled a void in George's heart he didn't even know existed. Thanksgiving arrived, and for the first time in decades, George wasn't alone. The Smiths insisted he join them, and as he sat at their table, surrounded by warmth and laughter, he felt a lump form in his throat. Mrs. Smith noticed his glistening eyes and gently squeezed his hand, wordlessly communicating that he belonged. When Christmas came, George was there to help decorate the Smiths' tree. He watched in awe as the children hung ornaments, their eyes sparkling with joy. Mr. Smith pulled him aside and handed him a small, wrapped gift. "From all of us," he said with a smile. George unwrapped it to find a framed photo of himself with the entire Smith family, taken at the park a few weeks earlier. He clutched it to his chest, overcome with emotion. For Jason's birthday, George surprised everyone by baking a cake himself. It was lopsided, and the frosting was a bit messy, but the delight on Jason's face made it all worthwhile. As they sang Happy Birthday, George realized he was singing along, his voice joining the chorus of people who had become his family. One quiet evening, as George sat on the Smith's porch swing with Mrs. Smith watching the sunset, he turned to her with tears in his eyes. "I never thought I'd have this," he said softly. "A family. People who care about me. I wasted so many years." Mrs. Smith patted his arm gently. "It's never too late, George. You're here now, and that's what matters." George nodded, a wave of gratitude washing over him. He thought about how different his life was now, how full of purpose and love. The Smiths had given him more than just friendship. They had given him a second chance at life, a chance to experience the joy of connection and the warmth of belonging. As he looked out at the neighborhood he once shunned, now filled with friendly faces and warm greetings, George felt a deep sense of peace. He had been given a precious gift, the opportunity to live a life filled with meaning and love, and he was determined to cherish every moment of it. As summer approached, George found himself filled with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He had an idea brewing, one that made his heart race with excitement and nervousness. After weeks of secret planning and hushed phone calls, the day finally arrived. George invited the Smith family for a walk in the local park, claiming he wanted to show them something. As they rounded the corner, the Smiths gasped in surprise. The usually quiet park was alive with activity. Colorful balloons bobbed in the breeze, tables laden with food dotted the grass, and familiar faces from the neighborhood beamed at them. "What's all this?" Mrs. Smith asked, her eyes wide with wonder. George smiled, a hint of shyness in his voice. "It's for you, for all of you." He led them to the center of the gathering where their neighbors had formed a circle. George cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We're here today to celebrate the Smith family. They've taught all of us, what it means to be truly compassionate and kind." George's eyes met each member of the Smith family as he continued. "When I was at my lowest, when I had pushed everyone away, the Smiths reached out. They saved my life, not just by calling an ambulance, but by showing me what it means to be part of a community." Tears glistened in Mrs. Smith's eyes as George spoke. Mr. Smith stood tall, his arm around his wife, a proud smile on his face. "The Smiths have touched all of our lives," George said, gesturing to the gathered neighbors. "They've shown us that a simple act of kindness can change everything. They've brought our neighborhood together in ways we never imagined." George's voice cracked with emotion as he concluded, "To the Smith family, thank you. Thank you for your friendship, your forgiveness, and for showing me the true meaning of family. You've given me a second chance at life, and I promise to pay it forward every day." As the gathering continued, George watched with a full heart as the neighborhood came together in celebration. Children laughed and played on the grass, their joyful shrieks filling the air. Adults chatted animatedly, sharing stories and swapping recipes. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, like a big family reunion. George found himself in the middle of it all, a far cry from the isolated man he had been just months ago. He moved from group to group, engaging in conversations and sharing laughs. The ease with which he interacted with others surprised him, and he realized how much he had been missing all these years. At one point, George caught sight of Jason, the youngest Smith child, playing with a group of kids. The boy looked up and waved enthusiastically at George, his gap-toothed smile beaming. George waved back, a lump forming in his throat as he remembered how close he had come to never knowing this wonderful child. Mrs. Smith approached George, holding a plate of food. "You've outdone yourself, George," she said warmly. "This is absolutely wonderful." George felt his cheeks flush with pride. "I couldn't have done it without everyone's help," he replied modestly. As the afternoon wore on, George found himself sitting at a picnic table, taking in the scene before him. He watched as Mr. Smith taught a group of kids how to throw a perfect frisbee, and Mrs. Smith chatted with some of the older residents, her infectious laughter carrying across the park. A sense of contentment washed over George. He realized that for the first time in years, he felt truly happy. The connections he had made, the friendships he had formed, had enriched his life in ways he never thought possible. He was no longer just existing. He was living. Truly living. George's eyes misted over as he thought about how different his life would be if he hadn't opened his heart to the Smiths and the community. He felt grateful for the second chance he had been given, and he silently vowed to never take it for granted. As the gathering began to wind down, George found himself sitting on a bench at the edge of the park. The golden light of the setting sun cast a warm glow over the scene, and he watched as families began to pack up their belongings and say their goodbyes. George's eyes drifted to the Smith family, who were helping to clean up the last of the decorations. He couldn't help but marvel at how much his life had changed since they had moved in across the street. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had been that cold, distant man who turned them away in their time of need. He thought back to the day of his heart attack, when the Smiths had found him and saved his life. That moment had been the turning point, the catalyst that set him on a path to rediscovering the joys of human connection. George felt a wave of gratitude wash over him as he remembered their kindness and forgiveness. His mind wandered through the months that followed, the tentative first steps of friendship, the slow but steady breaking down of the walls he had built around himself. He remembered the first time he had truly laughed in years during a game night with the Smiths. He thought of the pride he felt when helping Jason with his homework, and the sense of purpose he found volunteering at the Veterans Foundation. George's gaze swept across the park, taking in the faces of his neighbors, people who had once been strangers but now felt like extended family. He realized that he knew their stories, their joys, and their struggles. He cared about them, and they cared about him in return. A profound sense of peace settled over George. For so long, he had believed that strength meant standing alone, relying only on himself. Now he understood that true strength came from being part of a community, from giving and receiving love and support. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, George felt a contentment he had never known before. He had found his place in the world, right here among these people who had opened their hearts to him. As the neighborhood gathering came to a close, George and the Smith family made their way back home. The warm evening air was filled with the gentle chirping of crickets and the distant laughter of children playing in their yards. George felt a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. "Why don't you join us on the porch, George?" Mrs. Smith asked with a warm smile. "It's such a beautiful evening." George nodded, his heart full of gratitude. "I'd love to," he replied softly. They settled onto the comfortable porch chairs, the wood creaking gently beneath them. Mr. Smith brought out a tray of lemonade, and they each took a glass, sipping the cool drink as they watched the sun begin its descent on the horizon. The sky was painted in vibrant hues of orange, pink, and purple, a breathtaking canvas that seemed to stretch endlessly before them. George felt a deep sense of peace wash over him as he sat surrounded by the Smith family. Little Jason snuggled up next to George, his small hand finding its way into George's weathered one. "I'm glad you're here, Mr. George," the boy said with a sleepy smile. George's eyes misted over as he gave Jason's hand a gentle squeeze. "I'm glad I'm here too, buddy," he whispered. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, George looked around at the faces of the people who had become his family. Mrs. Smith was humming softly, her hand intertwined with her husband's. Sarah and Michael, the older Smith children, were quietly discussing their plans for the upcoming school year. George felt a smile spread across his face, one that reached deep into his soul. He was content, truly happy for the first time in years. The loneliness that had once consumed him felt like a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of love and connection. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in a final burst of color, George took a deep breath, savoring the moment. He was home, surrounded by people who cared for him, who had shown him the true meaning of compassion and forgiveness. In this peaceful scene, watching the sunset with his newfound family, George knew that his life had been transformed in the most beautiful and unexpected way. Would you extend kindness to someone who had previously turned you away, similar to the Smiths' act towards George, who refuses to help them at first? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to my channel. I am spending hours upon hours writing these heartwarming stories for you, and your support is what keeps me going.